So you're basically arguing that you don't think the U.S. is doing enough to stop the bloodshed in Syria. Is that right?
I don't think they're doing enough. Even usually the U.S. are way more ahead than the EU. But what's surprisingly to see only 3 people imposed sanction by the U.S. government. Well, the EU imposed sanction of 14 US Syrian officials after the bloodshed happened and the killing of innocent protesters happened. So I still believe yesterday State Secretary Hillary Clinton comments about President al-Assad. I still believe that he can stop the killing and start reform. And I mean, how you can expect from somebody who's killing to start reform? The comment itself, it's unbelievable. And that's not because the United States doesn't know what's going on. I mean, WikiLeaks have shown that U.S. were aware about every single thing happening in the Middle East and have shown their double standards toward Middle East people and the governments. They kept dealing with dictators, and despite the fact they were aware that those people are not representing their nations and they are not elected. But that's because of the interest of the United States. The United States scared of the Islamists if they can take power. The Israelis pushing in U.S. In the State Department, in the White House. We don't want to remove the Assad regime because he's securing the border with Israel, and we have never witnessed any violence on the border, despite the fact we have a war status declared with Syria. So it's mixed of interest and double standards that's ruling the situation now.
Michael, you want to comment on that? Is that your perception of what's going on in Syria, and do you think U.S. policy is on the right course, or what?
I have a very similar analysis. I think what happened, you know, it's almost, the sequence is almost kind of unfortunate because Egypt and Tunisia are actually the easiest cases because they're Egypt and Tunisia are like nation states, and you can get rid of Mubarak and you still have an Egyptian political system that can keep order. So if you go back to February 10th, February 11th, and you look at the rhetoric of President Obama, as Mohammed said, I mean, it was absolutely soaring and universal rhetoric, you had the United States standing with the people against Mubarak. Well, then came Libya, and all of a sudden it looked a lot more difficult because the Libyan system is one where everybody who supports Gaddafi realizes that if Gaddafi goes, they're going to go too, and not just lose power, they're going to probably lose their lives. So you're in a system like that, you're in for a penny and in for a pound, and you have a civil war on your hands. And the United States looked at that, and it was a lot messier. And you could see us moving away from the universal rhetoric. The way I read it was, when we moved to Libya, then there was a split in the administration between some of the more idealistic members and some of the people who were a little bit more concerned about getting involved in another war in the Middle East. I mean, particularly, obviously, Secretary Gates was against the Libyan policy. So then, by the time we got down to Syria, we'd been chastened. And it's unfortunate because I agree with Mohammed that we've totally lost any statement of principle with respect to Syria. And the statements from the Secretary of State that he's a reformer is just an insult to the people that are being shot in the street. No Syrian believes, no Syrian who is actually interested in reform believes that he's a reformer. So it seems to me that there's a position down the middle that can be taken. I mean, we may be worried about intervention in Syria, but we can still stand for principle, and we've lost the principle with respect to Syria. Last statement on that too. It's particularly disturbing to see it with respect to Syria because Syria is a case which is almost doesn't exist in the Middle East, where our principles and our strategic interests are in perfect alignment. And Syria is. It's an ally of Iran. It's an enemy of Israel. It's opposed the United States project everywhere in the region. It streamed al-Qaeda fighters into Iraq during the Iraq War, and yet we're giving the Syrian regime a pass. It boggles the imagination.
Jim, you wanted to add on that?
Yeah, I say this not as an excuse, but as an explanation. In several of these cases, including Syria, there's a really complicated scenario that we have to address. the neighbors of Syria don't want Assad pushed aside because they're afraid of what comes next. So we have not been sure-footed in shifting from one horse to another, but there are at least some reasons why they didn't. And of course, oil is another big one, not from Syria, but from Saudi Arabia. The second point I would make is North Africa is almost, in some respects, right under the armpit problem for Europe. Immigration, poverty, and so on. And so it stands to reason that they would be quicker off the draw, thinking about aid and thinking about bombing raids through NATO, the French Air Force, and so on, than we would. And we have been willing to lead from behind, as this saying goes, because it is precisely a more critical issue for Europe than it is for us, except on the issue of oil.
Harry, you were in Tripoli, and I watched one of your reports in which you said it's a company town, and that company was Gaddafi Inc., I think. You want to just give a little sense of how you saw things when you were there?
Well, I think it's not so different from Syria. People, I think, are very afraid. Libya reminded me of Iraq before the U.S. invasion. We were there about a week before the war started. And to walk down the street once you shook your mind, or just to try and engage in conversation with folks, people to be seen on the street with a Westerner, there's such a phenomenal system of spying that goes on, both that went on in Iraq and still goes on in Libya today. People were literally scared to death to be having a conversation with the Westerner. The looks on their eyes was sheer terror. I think there's similarities between Syria and Libya from the standpoint of how these places are run. You've seen the ruthlessness in Syria with which the regime has responded to these protests, and Libya in particular. It's not about politics. It's about some sort of. It's more like a mafia than anything else, and you understand why the people there wanted overthrown, but you also understand that everyone, especially in a place like Tripoli where people are so hooked up to the regime, so to speak, know that it's a very risky and potentially treacherous business.
You get this perception that the rebels in Libya are a kind of disorganized lot. Jim, I know you had some insights about that, and I thought it might be interesting to share those thoughts.
Well, very briefly, this is secondhand, but we had several people in Libya for the last month or so, and we have a long history of involvement, that is Human Rights Watch, in Libya, so we know a lot of people there. And the reports I got back this last week when we had a big meeting of our folks from these fellows coming back from Libya was that the rebels clearly don't know how to fight, don't have the arms to fight even if they knew how, but that what they have demonstrated is an extraordinary, fast-learned capacity for self-governance, and that they're doing a hell of a job in getting the garbage picked up and whatnot else and so on. Otherwise, the place would be going to pieces in the eastern sector. Secondly, they are taking guidance from the West, not from political Islam, on what kind of values they want to push forward as they're going towards forming a government. And they are democratic, they are rule of law, they are transparency, they are no detentions without trial and so forth and so on. Will they live up to all of these? I don't know. But the report I get anyway is that there is not a lot of fragmentation among them. There is rather a uniform sense that if they don't do this right, Libya will be split up, and that is the last thing they want.
How do you see the future of Libya? Can you call it?
No, I don't think you can. Well, I think you can call it in this respect. We don't know when, we don't know exactly how, we don't know which forces are going to do it, whether it'll be betrayal within Libya or forces from outside. But what we do know, at some point, the Gaddafi family is finished. there is no way he's going to be able to put back a long-term governance of Libya after what has happened and what is continuing to happen. Secondly, the forces, an interesting thing about this round, this particular Arab Spring, Michael will tell you there have been other ones like back in the 50s, is this one has been internationalized rather quickly. Arab leaders are beginning to play a role to impose on Yemen, Libya, and perhaps Syria when they're through, efforts at reform. NATO has stretched the boundaries of protecting civilians in the bombings that are going on now. Clearly, they're trying to rig the game in favor of the reformists in Libya. The EU, as I said, they haven't got their act together yet, but they're moving with a certain kind of urgency because the problems of North Africa are the problems of Europe, and they know it. So I think it's a matter of time. We just don't know whether it's going to be a month, 2 months, 6 months, or what. Mohammed thinks it's going to be fairly soon.
Yeah, my belief is in Yemen and in Libya both, it's going to be very soon because it's almost over in Yemen, 4 million protesting each Friday. I mean, it's a time matter only, and I estimate this time weeks in Yemen. And my belief is if US and NATO wants to finish Gaddafi faster, they can do that, but their fear still that those groups and rebels, are they Islamists? If we arm them, are we arming another Taliban after we get rid of the Gaddafi, similar to the scenario we've done before in Afghanistan against the Soviets? That's the main point, but my belief is really they can finish Gaddafi faster, and it's a time matter for him.
What about Assad?
The military intervention in Syria is much harder because Iran from side, Hezbollah and Hamas now is out of Syrian's regime hands because Egypt are adopting them in the reconciliation, but with another Palestinian groups. But still, it's very hard and difficult to see U.S. and NATO having military operation there. Hezbollah and Israel in the borders. Hezbollah not going to watch U.S. And EU because the fall of the Syrian regime, that's meaning the fall of Hezbollah line of arms and money from Iran, and they're going to cut these lines of arms and empowering these groups, and that means Gulf and Saudi Arabia and entire Arab governments will be in the same shared interest or common interest with Israel against Iran, and Iran won't see or let the Syrian regime fall down. And that's why when President Obama imposes the sanction on 3 of Syrian officials, he did on the Al-Quds groups or Jerusalem groups in the Basij in Iran, because he believes those people are helping the Syrian regime in cracking down the protesters in Syria, similar to the way and the strategy they have used in Iran in 2009 in the election, which is, I believe, yes, because this electric sticks has been used in Syria. It came from Iran, and in the 3rd week of the protest, Turkey stopped the ship was from Tehran to Damascus, was full of individual weapons and electric sticks and all this tear gas containers. So I believe it's much harder to intervene in military operation, but I still believe US and EU can play a better role in that. It's notable to mention that where in North Africa, not only North Africa, but where the places US has more leverage with the government, it was the places we witnessed less dead bodies, Egypt, Tunisia, and Yemen, because US can pressure those people seriously, and they can put them in the pressure, and a serious pressure, and trying to reduce the numbers of dead bodies as much as they can. And I believe they can play a better role if they want. And again, we're asking here if the United States really believes the fall of the Assad regime is going to turn in their favors or not.